Okay, if I could just ask everyone to grab their seats and we'll get underway. And firstly, welcome to the ASPG Victorian Chapter's third seminar for 2023, this time on the topic of political donations and lobbying. Before commencing seminar proceedings, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which the Parliament House sits and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. My name's Andrew Young, I'm the Chair of the Victorian Chapter and I'm pleased to open the session. Before handing over to Colleen Lewis and our panel members, I'd like to briefly remind everyone of what the Australasian Study of Parliament Group is, and I'd like to acknowledge that the ASPG benefits from Parliament making itself available as a venue for chapter activities, and we thank the Parliament for that. It's been happening for decades. The Australasian Study of Parliament Group is a not-for-profit apolitical entity and includes state and territory chapters. Membership is open to all. The chapter's objectives include providing forums such as this seminar, informing and educating the public about Parliament and contributing to the process of reforms and improvement of parliamentary institutions and the legislative process. The ASPG also has an important purpose of promoting high-level research and writing, and at the national level the ASPG publishes the Australian Parliamentary Review Journal, overseen by an editorial board and standards of academic integrity. So if you are not a member and are interested in doing so, please come and either see us after the seminar, or Rachel near the door over there has a QR code poster. You can always use the QR code to download some information about the association. Please note the seminar is being recorded, so if you have any concerns, please see us at the end of the seminar. Before I get on to the panel, I just also want to acknowledge Professor Charles Sanford in the audience, and who's just taken on the role as the new Parliamentary Integrity Advisor. So thank you also for attending tonight. So we're thrilled that we've been able to assemble such a high quality panel for this topic, along with our facilitator, Dr. Colleen Lewis, and Colleen, of course, is also a member of our ASPG executive. So I'll start by introducing Colleen. Dr. Lewis is an Honorary Professor, Australian Studies Institute, ANU, an Associate of the Centre for Public Integrity and member of the Accountability Roundtable, and Colleen's a long-time researcher into public sector accountability issues. Our panel, in alphabetical order, Bill Ford, down the far end. In fact, Bill was a member here when I first started. Sat just behind me when I sat at the table and didn't need a microphone. Bill is Strategic Counsel for the Aksara Group and former member of Victoria's Legislative Council 1992 to 2006, which included serving as Chair of the Public Accounts Committee. In the middle is the Honourable Justice Robert Redlich, ACKC, and the most recently former Commissioner of IBAC and former Judge of the Supreme Court of Victoria's Court of Appeal. And at this end, Dr. Catherine Williams. Catherine is the Director of the Centre for Public Integrity and co-author of the 2022 book titled Keeping Them Honest. Once again, in my capacity as Chair, I thank the panel members for giving us their valuable time and expertise, and I'm now very delighted to hand over to Dr. Colleen Lewis.
Thank you, Andrew. I was told to tilt the microphone down given the discrepancies in height. I too would like to say thank you to our esteemed panel for agreeing to come and share their extensive knowledge with us today. We are going to be looking at lobbying and then political donations, and it will be within the framework of the public interest, and this is what we're really concerned and interested about here. I'm going to start with lobbying and then move on to political donations. So I'm assuming that not everybody knows everything there is to know about lobbying, so I'm just going to ask Catherine and Robert to give a brief overview of what the lobbying regulations are here in Victoria, and then I will be asking Bill some questions about lobbying. Shall I start with you, Catherine?
Thank you, Colleen. And I think the point that you make about public interest at the start is a really important one, because we would always acknowledge that lobbying does have the potential to have a really beneficial impact. The difficulty is where there is insufficient transparency, which is what we believe is the case at the moment. And there are a couple of reasons that we believe that's the case in this state. The first is that the governing regulation is a code of conduct. It's not enshrined in legislation. And it also doesn't apply to all lobbyists. It applies partly to in-house lobbyists. It doesn't cover them fully. The other difficulty we would say exists in Victoria relates to the sanctions that are available where a breach might occur. So the sanctions are limited to deregistration. Other jurisdictions have a range of penalties available that would start with, aside from deregistration, fines, also potential jail time in some jurisdictions. The final key element of Victoria's lobbying framework that we see as a problem is the cooling off period that's in place. So it's either 12 months in the case of regulated senior public servants or 18 months in the case of members. And we say that that would need to be substantially longer if it's going to be meaningful. Robert, do you have anything you'd like to add on this?
Thanks, Kathleen. Just to reinforce the initial point that, of course, in a democratic society, it's fundamental that persons and entities are able to make representations to those who make decisions. And whilst I think we will all be making observations about the inadequacy of the existing lobbying regime, it's essential to bear in mind that that's got to be balanced with the right to ensure representation can be made. As Kathleen says, the lobbying in Victoria is in the realm of codes of conduct. There are no statutory provisions at all in relation to lobbying. And so, first and foremost, from the Commission IBAC's perspective and the report that we tabled late last year on donations and lobbying, the first thing we say is that it's essential that there is legislation that puts into place the requirements for lobbying so that they're no longer amenable to change depending on the government of the day. The three codes, just to fulfil the picture, the first code is the code for ministers and parliamentary secretaries, and the second is the code for ministerial staff, which was published for the first time last year, shortly before one of IBAC's reports was tabled. And of course the code which deals with lobbyists. So they're the three codes that we will be talking about in the course of the discussion. Do you want to add anything, Bill?
Not particularly on the regulation side of the lobbying, I'll leave that to you, but I'm really happy if you'd like me to say a few words about lobbying.
Yes, I would, and also because we want to have balance here and not everything to be what the problems are, you might look also, Bill, to tell us what are the advantages of being able to be a lobbyist to government as well.
Okay, thanks, and thanks for the opportunity to be here. Let me start by saying I think it's really odious for people to quote themselves, but I'm going to do it anyway. 30 years ago in this place, in my first contribution, I quoted Sir Raymond Garrett, who used to be the President of the Upper House, and in his maiden speech, he was the first member for Templestowe. In his maiden speech, he said, "My view is that we as legislators should try to do the greatest good for the greatest amount of people." Fully agree. I then went on to say that I believe that people of goodwill operating from sound philosophical and economic viewpoint and given accurate information are more likely than not to act in the broad common interest, which I'm close enough to public interest. The crucial words there are accurate information. And I'm a great believer in the fact that the governments need to get information from everywhere and often. And so what do you do in a circumstance where governments don't want that information? Public servants don't want that information. People come to me, to people like me. So, quick background. I signed the bit that says I was the Deputy Director of the Liberal Party in the 80s. I signed the bit that says I was a Parliamentary Secretary as well. But I was in Parliament for 14 years and I've been a lobbyist for longer than that. And the crucial thing about lobbying, and you can write all the rules and regulations and shine them any way you like, is it's a person business, it's a people business. And I am dealing with people now who are clients of mine that I first met when I was working for the Liberal Party in the 1980s. So how do you get information? Now, the two examples I want to do, first one is container deposit legislation was opposed by the government of the day until very recently, and there was a bunch of lobbying involved, so now we've got CDS schemes being rolled out. That wouldn't have happened, in my view, in the time it has without the intervention of people who were prepared to mount the arguments to government about why this was a good idea. The better example, and the one I love, 2007, James Merlino wrote a letter that stopped cage fighting in Victoria after a campaign by the Herald Sun. The UFC hired me in 2013. The government of the day wouldn't have a bar of it. The Labor opposition did. I met with various members of them. They announced their policy was to abolish the ban on cage fighting. We had 50,000 people at Marvel Stadium for Ronda Rousey. But the point is, there was an argument to be made and we made it and we got things done. So if you want stuff done, don't leave it to the public service. Cast your net as widely as you can. And my number's readily available if you need me.
We'll just scrub that last part. I will be in trouble, Bill. Don't do that to me. Look, thank you very much. Anybody want to comment on Bill's last comment? I'd just like to ask Catherine and Robert now, please, if they could discuss ways that they think that the public interest could be better served by amendments, not only the ones you've mentioned, but is there other things that could happen that would actually mean that the focus on lobbying would always be on the public interest, or to try and convince government in a legitimate way that there are other ways of looking at problems and that the people will benefit if those other perspectives are actually looked at?
Thank you, Colleen. So aside from the things that we've spoken about, and I mean, I do want to clearly acknowledge that as I said at the outset, we see the potential for lobbying to have really beneficial impacts for the public interest. The key thing is around transparency. So one of the things that I see here that we haven't yet spoken about is the publication of ministerial diary, the requirement that ministerial diaries should be published. So we know that at the moment this requirement exists in the ACT, it exists in New South Wales, it exists in Queensland, and I'm not sure if any of you have ever mined those disclosures for information, but we do that regularly, and they can be really valuable sources of information about who is seeing whom and when and in relation to what, and that level of transparency is vitally important if the public is going to be able to trust that public policy decisions are being driven by what is in their best interests rather than by the interests of people who have the resources available to access professional lobbyists. So to my mind, that's fundamentally important and a key difficulty of what is missing here, the transparency of access to ministers and ministerial staff.
Good, thank you. Robert.
Resist the temptation to descend too much into the detail of the IBAC Commission's report of last year, but I'll try and make some general observations which hopefully will instil some discussion between us. So the first is, when the Commission published the report last year, it was prior to the publishing of Operation Sandon, which is the investigation dealing with the Casey Council. And that report, if any of you want some bedtime reading in lieu of a glass of red wine, I would recommend it's a good read. But the important thing is it's all about lobbying. If you read it, you'll see what extraordinary lengths people will go to lobby decision makers. And the thing that emerged, of course, was there are no codes of conduct in relation to lobbying at local government level. So it's an arid field at the moment. That's one of the reasons why legislation is so important, because at present there is none to control the behaviour of lobbyists in dealing with councillors. But what else has emerged from Operation Sandon, as reflected in the report we tabled last year, and the recommendations are repeated again in the report in Operation Sandon? First and foremost is the fact that the definition of lobbying activity in the Lobbyists' Code is far too narrow, and it depends upon the person who is engaged in the activity being in the business of lobbying. And the code requires that those who are in the business of lobbying must be registered. That's the total ambit of the code. So for those who are not in the business of lobbying, there is no requirement under the code to register, and that means that, as Sandon demonstrated, there are a very large number of people who lobby who are not in the business of lobbying and who therefore have no obligations to comply with the code of conduct. So what sort of people are we talking about? We're talking about members of parliament who lobby the minister. Now, it's important to recognise immediately that, of course, members of parliament have a responsibility to their constituents, and so they may very genuinely have matters that they wish to raise with a minister. But if they are representing or making representations on the basis of representations that have been made by an individual or an entity to them for the specific purpose of them in turn going to the minister, they should be caught by an appropriate lobbying regime. And it shouldn't be open to them to say, well, look, yes, Mr so-and-so asked me to go and speak to the minister about a planning issue, but I also took the view that it was in the best interests of the constituents that I advanced that argument. Of course, that may be a dilemma for a Member of Parliament, but in those circumstances, a proper legislative scheme should require the Member of Parliament to identify for the Minister that there has been a specific representation made to them by an individual who has a vested interest in a particular outcome. So therein are the two major problems at the moment with the code. The activity is not broad enough, and the lobbyist definition is far too narrow, and it needs to capture everyone who makes representations to ministers which have the capacity to influence the decision-making process. That's the fundamental. And then we turn to the question, and if someone is engaged in a lobbying activity, what sort of record is there going to be of the fact that they have made a lobbying representation? Even under the code, it's wholly inadequate. So we don't know who lobbies a minister. We don't know who lobbies a ministerial advisor. We don't have any record of that lobbying event. We are not told what they lobbied about. And we are so far behind New South Wales and Queensland, and as I think Kathleen touched on a few moments ago, Even though they are well in front of Victoria, in the last 12 months they have both recognised through the Coldrake report in Queensland and Operation Eclipse, which is the ICAC New South Wales report, they have both recognised that their current scheme is still grossly inadequate. We have got a long way to go if we want to get to a point where we can be sure that there is transparency about a process that precedes decision making.
Thank you. Bill, would you like to also comment, please, on the idea of the ministerial diaries?
Sure.
Yeah, as a former MP,
Yeah,
would be
and
really
I
interesting.
don't want to be overly critical, but lobbying is relationship-based. And I said that I'm still working with people that I met 40 years ago. So a ministerial advisor goes to a branch meeting. In his head, he's got all sorts of things. There's a branch member there who wants something done. He has a conversation to his mate in the same branch. Now, by your definition, that's lobbying. My definition, that's a couple of mates having a chat about getting stuff done, right? And the problem that you've got is that every rule that you try and bring in to narrow this gap will run into the problem that the people that I deal with are my friends and always have been, my friends and my colleagues from both sides of the chamber. And I will continue, when I'm invited, to go to farewells for public servants or ministers or funerals or whatever. I've seen some serious lobbying done at funerals. Enough.
Well, yes.
Yeah, so look, you can publish their diaries, and in their diary will be what they want to put, right? So it didn't have that I walked down to the coffee shop and bought myself a copy and spoke to the minister in the coffee shop, because that's not a meeting. But it is lobbying, and I've had many a meeting in a coffee shop.
Did anybody like to comment on those?
Well, I mean, we'd say that that is a meeting, and that would need to be disclosed. And I mean, I think an interesting conversation I had recently was with a visiting professor who works with the OECD from Finland originally. And we were talking about our efforts to drive some lobbying reform progress here. And she said to me, but don't your lobbyists want to be regulated? And I laughed at her because so far the response has been, and maybe I'm wrong about this, Bill, maybe you'll correct me, but so far the response that we have received is that no, there's resistance to regulation. But maybe I'm happy to be corrected on that. But she was talking about how in Finland they were really eager to be regulated because they saw that it would bring legitimacy to their activities, and they were keen to have that legitimacy.
Yeah, well, and me too. I love being legitimate, but it doesn't mean that every meeting I have gets written down somewhere or notes are kept, and it doesn't mean that everybody knows or should know what I've said where or who or why. Does it?
I think it should.
Yes.
I'm sorry,
Yes.
I'm against you there, Bill.
Well, good. I'm glad you're against me. But you see, I live in the practical world.
But Bill, I mean, meeting somebody in a coffee shop and then saying, hi, hi
sorry,
Fred, how are you going, and all that, that's not lobbying, that's discussing a mutual thing.
I have a specific instance in mind where I was at a coffee meeting with a different person, and the minister walked by, tapped me on the shoulder and said, "Hey Bill, nice to see you." And I got up from there and I walked with him while he ordered his coffee, and I had 2 minutes, and I said to him, "You're likely to get this on your table sometime soon. I'd be really happy to talk to one of your staff about it." Right? That's all.
So then if you spoke to the staff, do you think that should be made public?
Well, I think that probably the conversation with the minister should have been made public, shouldn't it? No.
That's all that was
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, there's got to be some common sense about this. So let me make a broad observation here. We're dealing with shifting sands in terms of the form that the executive branch of government takes. If we look at what's happened over the last 40 years, with the growth in the sphere of influence of ministerial advisors, we now have a new class of persons that play or can play an influential role in the decision-making process. And as Operation Sandon shows, the astute interested party or their lobbyist, or someone who says they're not a lobbyist but an advocate, will often see the best way to the minister is through a ministerial advisor or through the chief of staff, who exert considerable influence with most ministers. They've all got to be caught by the concept of lobbying, and the need for diary records can't be confined to the minister, it has to extend to their advisors. Now, what has to be recorded is when someone is making a representation, is advocating that a particular interest be adopted or a decision of a particular sort is made. We're not talking about you telling a minister, I'd like to come and see you when I have an opportunity. We're talking about a conversation which is designed or intended to influence the decision maker or the decision maker's staff. And the records need to be such that the members of the public can see what has taken place between the lobbyist and the person they are seeking to influence. They need to know that there was such a communication, and they need to know, in the briefest form, they need to know the substance of it. What's the point of having decision-making that may or may not be in the public interest if we cannot understand the process that led to that decision being made?
Thank you. Bill, you did pick up. Do you want to make a quick comment or no? You...
I might say I've been done over. So.
Robert, I have a question for you. I've read a few of the reports and I just wondered whether you could tell us what you think were the main problems in terms of lobbying that was in the Sandon report, what you highlighted in the donations and lobbying report. I think the Clara report was another one. Going back to, so is there a common theme throughout in terms of the problems?
Well, yes, the common themes are, first, too often people don't accept that they are fulfilling a lobbyist's role. There's confusion and uncertainty, or in the case of some, absolute certainty that I'm not a lobbyist, I'm only an advocate. So that's got to be clarified. There's Operation Daintree, which was published in April this year, concerned intensive lobbying by the Secretary of the Health Workers Union. The contract which was ultimately given to the Health Workers Union and which was found by the Commission not to be in the public interest, recognised by every witness who gave evidence from the government perspective that it ultimately was accepted. It's a contract which should never have been granted. It came about because of the most intense lobbying by the Secretary of the Union with the most senior people in government. And none of it was recorded. None of it. Not one word of the meetings between the Secretary and those who made the ultimate decisions in terms of government policy in giving the union the role of training health workers who were in the front line for who were concerned about occupational violence. Not one of those meetings was ever recorded and the content of them disclosed. Critical. If you're going to enable the public to make an informed judgment about whether or not a process was properly followed and whether the outcome served the public interest, you needed to know about those communications. which does highlight an issue which I'll just touch on and move on, and that is unions in an ALP government occupy a privileged place, affiliated unions in particular. They don't fall within the definition of a lobbyist. That needs to be addressed, because irrespective of who it is, we must know on the record when representations are being made either to the decision maker or someone who works with the decision maker who's capable of influencing the decision maker.
Good, thank you. And it'll have to be quick, Bill, because we
Very
have
quick.
to move on to political donations.
One fundamental thing, though, is that people who want to lobby will always find a way of doing it. No matter what, they will find a way of doing it. And you can change all the rules, you can ban success fees, all the rest of it. Not a skerrick difference, because governments want secrecy. It's in their interest to have secrecy. They don't want this stuff in the public arena because then they get criticised, etc., etc. So there's a fundamental disconnect between the desire for information to be made public to people and the desire of government to actually do stuff without being found out. Not found out. To do stuff without publicising the sausage making.
And public office is a public trust, is my comment.
I agree entirely.
Yeah, yes. It'll have to be very quick if you want to say anything, because we do have to get on to political donations, so thanks.
I'll just say very briefly we would say to that that's not a reason not to regulate. It'd be a reason to do regular statutory reviews of what's happening and change things where it needs to happen, but it's not an excuse not to regulate. And we do see, as I say, we actually use very often ministerial diaries from other jurisdictions, and they are disclosing things that are of great value and of great interest to the public. So there's not, of course, I understand what you say, that there are going to be cases when the government wants to be secretive, and we have to do our very best to design the regulation in such a way that it's harder for them to do that, and adapt regulation as practices change or information about them emerges.
May I just add to that? Maybe I'm a traditionalist. I start from the assumption, Bill, that if we have a set of regulations or legislation, most people will recognise that provides them with some moral guidance as to how they behave. Of course, there'll be individuals who will still look for a way around the system, but I don't think any of us take the view that there's no benefit in legislating and regulating the way in which people should behave. For most, that will provide them with useful guidance.
Yeah, that's true. Well, thank you very much. I just wish we had another hour. I think we could all learn a lot. So thank you for that. But we need to move on to political donations. And there is quite often a link between political donations and lobbying. So maybe some of the issues we've already covered might arise again. But the government here has acted in the last few years to actually do something about the political donations regime here in Victoria, to their credit, and that is something that we applaud, because they are a lot better than what happens at the federal level at the moment, which is really quite a worrying framework for political donations. But the latest JSCEM, the Joint Standing Committee on Electoral Matters, at the federal level, has brought out an interim report. And a lot of the recommendations in that interim report are exactly what experts in this area have been campaigning for years and years and years. And eventually they are moving. Now, it is only an interim report, but it really does give one heart that they are going to do something to bring political donations up to a level where they should be. But I was just wondering that here in Victoria and at the federal level, one of the pushbacks always when it comes to wanting to do anything about political donations is that nobody wants a cap on the expenditure that can happen in a electoral campaign. So I was just trying to get ideas from the panel, please. Do you think we should actually, there's a double-barrel question, which I won't allow from the audience, by the way, but there's a double-barrel question. Should we actually have caps on the amount of money that we can actually expend on electoral campaigns? And the other one is, should we just not allow any political donations whatsoever and come to a position where we, the public, out of our taxes, fund electoral campaigns, and we decide what the cap should be through an independent panel to decide what that level should be? So there we go. I'll start with you, Catherine, and we'll go down the...
Thank you. So to address the issue of expenditure caps first, the introduction of expenditure caps is something that the Centre for Public Integrity has been very supportive of for a long time now. We do believe that their design needs to be very, very careful so that you don't make it impossible for new entrants. So we have to be very careful in the design. But we see them as vitally important because if you have a situation where expenditure is totally unrestricted, you risk ending up with a situation where elections are reduced to little more than auctions, and that's not a desirable state of affairs. We also know that, and this is perhaps a bit different in Victoria, although there are complexities around what's captured by the donations caps here. At the federal level, obviously, there are no donations caps in place at the moment, and so the fact that you've got no donations caps, you've got no expenditure caps, means that there's this arms race being driven and this continual need to raise more money so that you can spend more money. So it's a substantial difficulty, and it's an area where we think the introduction of caps could have a really positive benefit. Colleen, you'll have to remind me the second branch of your question.
Should we just scrap all political donations and should they be funded publicly? Any election campaign is funded publicly?
I think that my answer to that would be no. There's constitutional difficulties there because of the implied freedom of political communication. Now, that can be infringed upon when there's evidence to justify that need. So like in the case of the ban of donations by property developers in New South Wales, that followed evidence that that was a corruptive influence, and there was therefore a justification to infringe on the freedom of political communications to make donations. So we have to bear in mind that constitutional limitation, and also we have to bear in mind that taxpayers might not like the idea of contributing even more money than what's contributed already to fund election campaigns. And we have to accept, I think, also that donations at the lower end of the scale can be a positive thing because they can demonstrate engagement by the population with the political process. So they're not always a bad thing. As long as they're appropriately regulated, they're not always going to be a bad thing.
Okay, thank you. Robert.
The interim report of the Senate Select Committee on Electoral Matters, which I think it's now about a month and a half old, almost entirely reached conclusions that appear in the IBAC Commission's report of late last year, repeated again in Operation Sandon, published only a couple of months ago. And their conclusion, IBAC's conclusion, the position which pertains in New South Wales and Queensland that there should be an expenditure limitation is recommended by all. Of course, it has to be balanced because there are minor parties, there are individuals, and one has to ensure an electoral environment which does not unfairly discriminate against those. But that said, there needs to be caps on expenditure allied with caps on individual donations. And again, I don't think there's any state of Australia that doesn't have caps on donations. and those that have caps on expenditure also have caps on donations. But I'm really encouraged by the interim conclusions of that committee, which reflect the views of state integrity agencies.
Good. Bill, do you have any
No,
comments? And then we'll
I don't have anything in particular
Okay.
to add to that.
Right. Well, look, we might, given time, go to questions from the audience. I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions, so I'm asking that people only ask one question. Don't do what I did and put in a double-barreled one. And if you don't mind me saying, not a long commentary, because I think I'd like to be able to give everybody an opportunity who wants to ask a question, and we've only got about 15 minutes. So please show your hands if you would like to ask a question. Tim, I'll start with you.
Thank you, Colleen, and thank you to the panel. Very interesting. I'm interested in exploring the idea of how far, if we want to get open diaries, how far should we expand the net? And Mr. Redlich, you mentioned that if an MP, say a backbencher, talks to a minister, and let's say a property developer has spoken to the backbencher, you want to be able to capture that somehow. There could even be occasions when non-government MPs could be caught up in that sort of activity as well. Not as commonly perhaps, but you could foreseeably imagine that. And so I'm just wondering, it wouldn't just be ministers' diaries we want to capture perhaps. It could be any MP who's been spoken to by someone who has an interest, say a financial interest, in an outcome. Would that be, I'm just trying to think of a definition.
Well, under the existing lobbyist code, under the existing lobbyist code, curiously, the only person that's got to be satisfied that the lobbyist is registered is not the lobbyist, but the person who's being lobbied. Quite a strange situation, so that needs to be addressed. But if lobbying is aligned correctly, then the requirements of registration will lead to a requirement that the lobbyist, the person doing the lobbying, has to record, as part of their registration process, has got to record their lobbying. I'm not sure that there's any less reason to think that a non-government member of parliament will seek to lobby a minister. If we're talking about persons that have an interest in seeing a particular legislative outcome, it could come just as easily from a member of parliament that's not in the party governing at a particular time. But I think that diaries, I don't understand why we have been so slow to follow our brothers and sisters interstate and overseas. I hasten to say, if you look at Scotland, Ireland, other places, there's a long-standing obligation to record these sorts of conversations, and it certainly has to extend to ministerial staff. Right now, ministerial staff leave office, and more often than not, there is not a single record of anything that they've done. There is no obligation on them to keep any record. I mean, we are in an extraordinary environment at the moment.
Catherine or... No. Anybody else want to make a comment? No. Yes, Julia.
I'm interested in, I guess, going back to the underlying principles, and I thought your opening statement in a democratic society, it's fundamental that anyone ought to be able to be represented to MPs. And that got me thinking about the people who don't lobby. That in that statement, there's a fundamental requirement of there's a quality requirement that
don't have privileged access.
They don't have privilege, exactly. So I guess it's a very sort of open kind of question, but what do we do about the people who don't lobby?
Hmm?
And should there be public monies available for bodies that do emerge?
Well, look, that's a valid consideration. I mean, we've got to start with the reality, though, that a decision maker, a minister or the government of the day, before they pass legislation, you will ordinarily expect they will have given very careful consideration to what they sense is a public need and a sense of what the majority would consider to be a desirable legislative outcome. Decision makers aren't in the process normally of making decisions without regard to what they sense is the community need. That said, there may be occasions where there isn't sufficient attention given to what a large percentage of the community actually want. And you're right to say that lobbying is directed to concerning privileged access, where people, because of their wealth or their contacts with people in power, their connections to the political party that's in government, have the opportunity to specially influence decision making.
Can I just dive in very quickly and say, my view is that the more information government gets from whatever source they get, the better. And I'm happy for anybody to provide information, but I say to all my clients, you've got to be able to deal with the minister, you've got to be able to deal with the public servant, you've got to be able to deal with the ministerial advisors. Because any one of the three can crawl your pitch, any one of the three can be your saviour, but getting information to government through the public service, I'll leave it there.
Please feel free to, as long as it's within the framework of the public interest.
Yeah, it's very much in the public interest because I'm a person who's spent my life in and around politics and business, right? And I've got those connections. And I was a public servant as well, so I know how this, a senior public servant, so I know how the public service works. And I've got to say that the public servants live in an isolation that means that they don't have access to the ordinary punter or to information more broadly. Sorry.
And I think there was another question from...
Well, I was just adding to the question of Julia about, I think,
No, yes, just that you added...
The point about groups do emerge about an issue. They're usually unseasoned people who don't have connections, but they care passionately, it very much affects them. They don't have access to public funds, they don't have funds. It takes resources to mount a campaign. Why shouldn't that be available to people?
We all do pro bono work. All of us.
Thank you.
Every single one of us
do but I'm just suggesting more systemically, why aren't there resources made available in the public interest?
It's an interesting proposition. Quite clearly, there needs to be some rebalancing of the decision-making process to try to bring in groups like this that don't have privileged access. The question of providing fund support is not one that we have considered previously, but potentially could be one good way forward. Certainly there needs to be a broad shift in how government decision-making is approached and preparedness to engage with groups that just don't have the privileged access.
Just for your information.
I'm sorry, I will have to... There's just only time for one more question, and the lady has her hand up. Yes.
So I'm puzzled by how, in this context, we can make policy based on evidence. There seem to be so many barriers to evidence-based policy making in our system. I think what actually stymies the public sector is not a lack of information, it's having to brief on the government of the day's policies.
question.
Well, if you take the UFC one, when we did that, we went and did some economic analysis of what having 50,000 people at Etihad Stadium would do, and that was a useful piece of information. We also did some demographic analysis, which we made available, which showed that there was a cohort of Victorians who would vote for a party who were really interested in lifting the ban on cage fighting. So there was a lot of work done behind the scenes in economic analysis and political analysis to form the views that were then put to the people we were lobbying to say, this is what we believe, now test it yourself. And they did.
I really lament that the lack of evidence-based policy, particularly the area that I tend to think of when I think about this is climate change, and the fact that we have seen such weak action in respect of climate. And one thing, one of our board members, Professor Ju Chong Tam at Melbourne University, speaks about democratic debilitation as explaining in part the reason for weak action on climate, and that debilitation is driven in part by state capture, which is caused by these lax lobbying regimes and poor regulation of political donations and expenditure. So look, I agree wholeheartedly with you. We must be, as far, in every possible case, trying to achieve evidence-based policy. And it's very, very difficult when you have these moneyed interests who are able to put forward what they say is evidence, and it might be, but it might not be objective. So it's really difficult.
Anybody else on the panel want to make a comment? If not, there is one more question from the floor, and then we're going to have to wrap it up, unfortunately.
Just so that my silence isn't misunderstood, I don't really feel that I can offer a comment on the extent to which the decision maker is able to have regard to evidence-based direction before implementing a particular decision. I think that's really got to be an answer, something that only those immersed in the actual decision-making process could talk about, namely how much inquiry, for example, does the relevant department make of those who are possessed of knowledge and information that bears upon what the right decision should be. I can't really offer any constructive response.
Very quickly, I'd just like to say that in the last 40 years, the relationship between the central agencies and the line agencies has changed so much that you're not going to get intelligent policy developed in the line agencies anymore. It all comes from the central agencies.
I thought you were going to mention the terrible word consultants.
No. Well, look, I think I'm going to hand back to our president, the Victorian Chapter, but I would just personally like to thank you all for an extremely informative and also entertaining. It was lovely to hear the different points of view come out, and which is what we were hoping for. So thank you for achieving what our objectives were, and I'll now hand back to Andrew. Thank you.
Thanks, Colleen. And if perhaps I could ask everyone to thank both Colleen and the panel for an outstanding presentation. Now, we'll declare these gifts somewhere. Yeah, don't worry, Lil, it's an evidence-based gift. As you all know, we have an outstanding parliamentary library who produce and auspice great work, and one of the great things they auspiced was a publication by Gideon Hay on this building called An Unfinished Masterpiece. And it's our great pleasure to, as a small token of appreciation for your efforts, to offer you all one as a gift, so thank you.
I think I'm now able to receive gifts.
We really do appreciate the fact that you put a lot of preparation into these sessions, and this is one small token of appreciation. Thank you for providing such a fantastically stimulating debate. It actually turned into a debate, which is actually the best thing we could have possibly hoped for. Thank you to everyone who attended today, because unless you attend, we don't have an ASPG. Just a reminder, if you're not a member and you're interested, scan that QR code down the back and you get some information. We hope to have our next seminar in October, which would be preceded by our annual general meeting. We'll confirm the date and the topic soon. Rachel, our secretary, is there anything else I forgot? No? Everything is good? Okay, well, if everyone could just once again thank our panel. Okay, thank you.